I first became aware of Jelani's work in The New Yorker in 2002. He's now a staff writer there. He's also the author of several books. To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip-hop aesthetic, which I have right here, the library copy. Yeah. The Devil and Dave Chappelle and other essays. His most recent book is The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress. Tonight, however, he will be speaking about the most current of issues. The United States and France as sibling democracies facing the common threat of terrorism, in a talk entitled Freedom from Fear, Democracy in a Time of Terror. Please join me in welcoming Jelani Cobb.
I'm very happy to be here this evening, and I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about and how it came about. You know, I've been writing a lot about race and, you know, the way that it has kind of reappeared or developed in American society in the Obama era. And I've been in the scene of a lot of the kind of flashpoints that we've seen in media in the past few years. I was in Charleston, I was in Ferguson, Missouri, I was in Baltimore around the incident with Freddie Gray that resulted in a riot there. And I wanted to talk about kind of what that looked like in the broad picture in terms of how race plays itself out. And then I thought about, after the attacks, I thought that was perhaps not the most timely or the most appropriate topic. And then I started reimagining this talk. And then I started thinking about the ways in which, you know, kind of our common experience with race in America and in France historically have insight or have implications for the ways in which societies that are democratic or attempting to be democratic relate to the threat of terrorism. And so that's where this topic came from today. And, you know, initially when we saw, you know, the coverage, and more times than we care to think about now, when we saw the most recent attacks, when we saw the Charlie Hebdo attacks, we saw the international outrage, and we saw in the United States this common theme of people talking about, you know, the French democracy and American democracy being kind of the sibling republics. For reasons that make perfect sense, you know, as both of these revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, being a product of the Enlightenment era, and there being the interwoven threads of connection between the French support of the American Revolution and the American admiration of the French Revolution, and, you know, Jefferson writing about Paris as the essential city, and the kind of common revolutionary air, I could say, of Thomas Paine, you know, who writes Common Sense and so movingly and effectively satirizes the British monarchy, and it really galvanizes the sense of outrage about colonialism and the depredations of the British crown, and then actually comes to France and is elected to the Assembly, on the strength of his kind of revolutionary credentials in the United States, and of these interwoven ties. And we can see the early history of Western democracy continually kind of playing back and forth this relationship. Of course, not all this is kind of roses. It's not entirely a bed of roses, because there's that undeclared war that the United States and France fought shortly after the American Revolution. But by and large, this has been a dialogue among democracies in their relationship. And one of the things that was also notable was, at the time, was both of these societies having to deal with the contradictions and the complications of democracy, especially as it related to capitalism and as it related to race. This is most notable in, you know, the biggest exception in the French Revolution, which is the idea of maintaining both colonies, particularly in the Caribbean where there is slavery, and the emancipation that happens in 1794, the abolition of slavery in the French colonies, that is short-lived, and 6 years later, slavery is reintroduced, seeing an 80% decline, after seeing an 80% decline in the productivity of their Caribbean possessions. Under Napoleon, slavery is reintroduced. And there's a similar kind of dynamic that we see in the United States about this idea of liberalism, and liberalism being cut short, being truncated, And most visibly, we see in the Declaration of Independence. Of course, the first draft of the Declaration of Independence denounces the transatlantic slave trade, which Jefferson calls an execrable trade and traffic in human beings. And that is edited out for a number of reasons, and so it doesn't make it into the final draft of the Declaration of Independence. We also see the document, the founding document of the United States, the Constitution, the governmental document of the United States, the Constitution, making these concessions to racial hierarchy. And as with the case with the French Revolution, there's an interesting kind of ambivalence in which we see the country kind of ping-pong back and forth about the extent to which emancipation and racial equality can coexist with the kind of democracy that they're attempting to create. And so right after the American Revolution, you see the former colonies, now states, begin emancipating African Americans or creating policies that lead to eventual abolition, which is what New York State does, kind of graduated abolition. But New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, there's a wave of emancipatory legislation that comes in the wake of the American Revolution, driven partly by the fact that people are cognizant of the obvious contradiction between fighting a war for liberty and equality and maintaining a group of people in kind of abject subjugation. And this is not solely, even though I mentioned northern states, it's not solely a northern phenomenon. As a matter of fact, Virginia comes within a few votes of actually abolishing slavery right after the end of the American Revolution. And in a similar context, we see this kind of truncated or curtailed by commercial considerations. Certainly the invention of the cotton gin at the end of the 18th century leads to a vastly increased amount of economic potential from the production of cotton. And from there leads to what we call King Cotton and the conflict over Southern agriculture, the Civil War, and so much as we know it. And so this contradiction, I think, is best encapsulated. I thought of two people when I was thinking about this as it related to African Americans or as it related to race, and it was two lives that I thought were most notably intertwined, in which these contradictions, two people who live in two completely different places, but their lives best highlight these contradictions in these revolutionary societies. And the first is Vincent O'shea, which some people are familiar with. But O'shea lived from 1755 to 1791. He was biracial. This time the language would have referred to him as mulatto, but he was a biracial person who was educated in France, but was of Haitian background and origin. And during the French Revolution, he began to articulate a demand for mulatto rights in the colonies, and became so deeply enmeshed in the demands of saying that this fervor for liberty and equality and fraternity be extended at least to the mulatto class in Haiti, that people in Haiti saw him as a threat to the established order. Now, as it stood, Haiti had a kind of inverted pyramid in terms of its power structure. About 500,000 Black people who are the enslaved population, and a tiny white elite who are the planter population, and then these buffering classes of kind of petit blanc and mulatto individuals. And the idea of enfranchising that population was thought to be too threatening, and O'shea was considered to have taken the French Revolution too seriously, to have taken it on its face value. And he was, in 1791, broken on the rack. He was arrested and tortured, broken on the rack. And so his death was meant to be a kind of warning that people should not perceive the liberalism of the French Revolution as extending to all persons. In the United States, we could talk about a similar individual, a kind of similar narrative, and that is in the person of David Walker, who was an abolitionist. He lived from 1794 to 1831. He's best known for a pamphlet that he published called David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And the appeal is a direct kind of spin upon or a revision of the United States Constitution. And he writes it simply as an abolitionist document. And he's saying that the very ideas that justified the American colonies breaking away from the British crown would justify individuals rising up en masse against the institution of slavery. Walker was from Massachusetts, he was from Boston. He was a tailor, and through his connections as a tailor, he managed to have this document smuggled to various places in the States, where because Boston is a port city, he got this pamphlet to people who would then disseminate it in various port cities. In 1831, Walker was found dead in his shop. It was widely believed, his death is kind of mysterious, but it was widely believed to have been the result of poisoning. And so both Walker and O'Shea kind of illustrated in their own biographical narrative the ways in which these contradictions were both apparent and deadly in the United States and France. And so I think it's important, though, to talk about the context in which this happens. It's very easy to be critical of as a matter of fact, I do this commonly as a writer. It's very easy to be critical and to point to the various hypocrisies of America as it relates to race. It is the most visible of many contradictions as it pertains to American democracy. It's very easy to point out the contradictions that we saw in Haiti, where the eventual emancipation that came with the result of the Haitian Revolution was accompanied by the staggering bill for self-emancipation that the French government imposed upon Haiti, in which the government still suffers under to this day. But in their defense, the vast majority, the census of history, the vast majority of people who've lived, who have ever lived in human society have existed under one form of tyranny or another. And the lesson that we should take from this is that liberty is inherently frail, it's inherently fragile, and it is amazingly novel as a conception for self-government in human history. And the parameters of liberty is really the issue that we have found ourselves disputing and debating. And this is what these conversations always have seemed to have in common. And so it's for this reason that the gifting of the Statue of Liberty, for instance, to the United States could have no greater significance from any country other than France. Its sibling democracy, and also a nation that had struggled with these same questions, as all democracies must, about the exact parameters of liberty in which it exists. Those bonds were further cemented in both of the world wars, in World War I and World War II. Now, it's interesting that Woodrow Wilson has become a topic of controversy of late in the United States. You've been following, you may have seen that Princeton University is struggling with the question about what to do with its most notable affiliate, which is Woodrow Wilson, the former president of the United States, given the embarrassment of his racial ideas. Woodrow Wilson reimposed segregation in Washington, D.C. He lauded the film Birth of a Nation and said that was the only problem with the film, which was a glorification of the Ku Klux Klan, was that this was history that was also tragically true, and saying that the Klan had arisen to defend whites from the menace of newly emancipated Black population, bent upon vengeance and rapacious pursuit of white womanhood. And so this is the person we're dealing with, Woodrow Wilson. But the irony is, of course, that at the conclusion of World War I, Wilson articulates the 14 points that he sees being essential to world peace or to world affairs in the post-Great War world. It's called the Great War at this point because people don't know that in just about 20 years they're going to actually do this whole thing again. And so after the Great War, he articulates these 14 points. And what's notable about this is that the 14 points are the basis for liberal internationalism in American foreign policy. And point number 5, Wilson actually says articulates a defense of self-determination among subject colonial people, which is a staggering thing to say. We are talking about people of color. And Wilson says this in Paris. He says, we believe that there needs to be self-determination for subject colonized peoples. And one of the things I think that's notable about this is that, it says to me that nations are like individuals, in that, Wilson's making this subtle or not so subtle criticism of the colonial states, the Western colonial states, but nations are like individuals in that it is often much easier to see the flaws in others than it is to see our own flaws. We could say that France returned the favor, having been a safe harbor, in effect, for generations of African American artists and intellectuals who come here and been, if you read James Baldwin, if you read Josephine Baker, and if you read Richard Wright or any of the other figures who Tyler Stovall talks about in his history of African Americans in Paris, you see that there is a kind of idea that people are able to sidestep the strictures of American Jim Crow in Paris and breathe more easily here or in France than they could in the United States. That notwithstanding, Baldwin does write very convincingly and very movingly in his essay collection, No Name in the Street, about the way in which his own freedom in Paris is contrasted by the absence of freedom among the Arab population in the city at the time. He's writing in the 1940s and 1950s. As a matter of fact, he talks, if you read his collection, Price of the Ticket, he talks very explicitly about the routine nature of police brutality in African American life in Harlem. That this is just a part, he says actually, what every child knows is that, and growing up in Harlem, is that they should hate the police. And he articulates why. Because they are essentially an arm of state authority and they behave in these ways that are particularly brutal. Baldwin lived in Harlem at the time the 1935 Harlem riot happened, which was a direct result of police brutality. That was a young man was accused of shoplifting and was beaten by police in Harlem. Baldwin lived in Harlem at the time of the 1943 Harlem riot. And so he knows this very clearly. And so when he writes in No Name in the Street that he witnesses French police beat a one-armed Arab vendor viciously, he's seeing a kind of refraction or an echo of his own experience, and understanding that his own liberty should not be confused with a kind of generic state of affairs in France. It's very difficult to consider this, to imagine this, knowing, as it were, that in 1945, in the liberation of Paris, that the French authorities enacted an essential whites-only policy, even though 2/3 of the French army at this point was made up of blacks who were from the colonial legions, the colonial possessions. But none of these soldiers were allowed to participate in the actual liberation or marching into France. And so these ideas find themselves kind of echoing and pinging around. And I wondered, why talk about these dual histories? Like, why drag ourselves through this particular narrative? And I thought that it was important to understand, particularly as these are two democracies that are confronting the common question of terrorism. And beyond that, the common question of illiberalism in the context of terrorism. So in 2001, or I should say in September of 2001, I was a new professor. I was in the first month of my first job at Spelman College. And I was teaching a class when someone came in and said that one of the trade towers, World Trade Center towers, had been hit by a plane. And I, like most people, assumed that this was some tragic accident. And then as I was leaving the class, about an hour later, someone told me that the second tower had been hit and that the first had fallen. And I, like millions of other people that day, had the slow dawning recognition that this was an act of international terrorism. And after that, a dialogue began, which I found troubling for many reasons. The dialogue began with people saying, this is the first experience that our country has with terrorism. That actually wasn't meant to be a joke line, but yeah, right. But people saying that this is the first experience that the country has had with terrorism. And it was a difficult thing to hear as a historian. It was an even more difficult thing to hear as an African American, because in fact the country has a very long history with terrorism. The American Revolution began with acts that could meet the current definition of terrorism. The Gaspee affair, or the Boston Tea Party, or any of the tarring and feathering incidents of British authorities. And so currently, the United States kind of federal definition of terrorism is acts of violence by non-state actors with the intent of terrorizing a population and influencing political behavior, I believe. It's something to that effect. And certainly that would qualify in what the revolutionaries in the American Revolution participated in. But beyond that, we have actual legislative history. The first anti-terrorism law in American history is the Klan Control Act of 1871. Specifically because Congress was concerned, the reason we had an anti-terrorism law in 1871 was that Congress was concerned that if the Klan became victorious, as they eventually were, if they were victorious in eliminating Black people from political participation, it would pave the way for the reascension of the Southern Democrats who had effectively torn the country in half during the Civil War, who had merely succeeded in their goal of overthrowing the American government. And so there was a kind of federal incentive to pass a law that would protect the rights of the newly emancipated African Americans, particularly because the only hopes for democracy were contingent upon these individuals being able to participate electorally. We were to move past the Reconstruction. We see that for 50 years in the South and the Midwest in particular, there is a dynamic of lynching which asserts itself and reasserts itself. And so for me as a person who teaches about lynching, I can't say that I've never taught about terrorism before September 11th. There's all sorts of terrorism that pops up in American history. There's labor disputes. There's the Haymarket affair in 1889. There are the Molly Maguires, which is a radical group of Irish coal miners who begin assassinating bosses who they feel are responsible for exploiting the labor of coal miners in Pennsylvania. There are an array of disputes. There's the Weather Underground, the kind of American analog to the Red Army faction in the 1960s. And then more recently, which was a kind of stunning oversight, there was Timothy McVeigh in 1994 and the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah office building. One of the things that we forget about that is that, we saw that that bombing took place and 168 people were killed in Oklahoma City. One of the things that we do not remember, or perhaps choose not to remember about the attacks of that year, in April of that year, is that McVeigh was actually reenacting a scene from a novel called The Turner Diaries, in which a federal office building is destroyed, is bombed, and it sparks a race war. And so this was very explicitly connected to this idea of creating a war to re-enshrine racial subjugation of African Americans, even in 1994. We didn't see it as that. And so, in looking at how terrorism is defined, there's an analyst by the name of Charles Townsend. He says that terrorism occurs in 4 different ways, primarily. That there is a kind of revanchist terrorism, which are acts of violence committed by people who are attempting to regain territory that they've lost or was seized from them. There is insurgent terrorism, which is terrorism that is directed at a force of occupation. There's the kind of millenarian terrorism, which are groups that are determined to hasten the day of the return of a deity. And there is revolutionary terrorism which is designed to overthrow or unseat a particular government. What's notable in our instance, in our contemporary context, is that we in the West are confronted by an organization which in some ways exists in all four of those categories, which commits acts of violence for all of these means and all these rationales. And the kind of dawning recognition of the nature of living in terrorism is something that I find to be kind of interesting, in that the study of the history of race in this country, in the United States, I could say in this country, but the study, I forget where I am. The dawning recognition that the study of the history of race in the United States actually provides insights into this question about how a democratic society can and should respond to terrorism. On September 12th, the New York Times published a letter. It's a remarkable letter. And that day, the New York Times published dozens of letters to the editor. The ruins of the World Trade Center were still smoldering, as they would for weeks more. And this letter said simply, "We do not know who did this. We do not know why it was done. But it is my fear that this act will rationalize acts of violence disparately throughout the world, and that this act will become a means by which democracy is eroded in this country." I read that letter years after September 11th and was stunned by the foresight and the insight that this writer had held in saying, this is what we should fear. So I look at this and say that I'm coming from New York, coming from Queens, New York, which is where I'm from, which is also a place that Donald Trump is from. I started telling people I go around the world apologizing. It's probably like my apologies. But it's also notable to me, in some ways intensely predictable, the idea that a provocation can become the basis of the eradication of the entire liberal idea. That we still struggle with this question of the parameters of liberalism. And I mentioned Thomas Paine at the beginning of this conversation, and it becomes kind of germane again, because Paine began being the person who was one of the most popular people in the American Revolution, and one of the most popular people in the French Revolution, but ended his life by being largely disdained by both. And the problem was that Paine, for many reasons we could say, but essentially they distilled down to Thomas Paine continued to think like a revolutionary even after the revolution. That Paine was not particularly content with the illiberal potential that democracies could hold, new fledgling democracies could display. And so in looking at the nature of the American response to September 11th, and looking at the questions that have become kind of more directly relevant to all of us since then, I was reminded that, one, the history of race, the history of this country, of the United States, has indicated that kind of race is incompatible with democracy. But in extrapolating that out to a bigger idea, it said more fundamentally, fear is incompatible with democracy. And fear metastasizes in particular ways. I'm going to give this example. I'm not talking about a particular democracy, certainly not a democracy, but I was in Russia in 2010. And I was teaching there on a Fulbright fellowship at Moscow University. And I was there when, in March of that year, the subways were bombed. 39 people were killed. As a matter of fact, one of the subway stations, 2 of them were bombed. One of them was a subway station that I traveled through each day that I taught in order to make a connection to go to the university. And days after this, I had to go to talk to my class. I had to go teach. And I went down, I'll say one thing that was kind of remarkable, bless you. I'll say one thing that was kind of remarkable about this experience is that I went to the subway station and just hours after the bombing, the trains were running again. And it seemed almost callous. I thought in the United States we would not have had trains running through this train station so quickly. And it seemed as if people had a kind of callousness about this violence. But then I noticed another thing that was remarkable, which is that people began to bring flowers to the memorial sites where people had died in this subway station. And then they brought more flowers, and then they brought more flowers, until they had mounds of flowers. And so that the train station itself smelled like smoke and roses. So that people were making a kind of memorial that went on for weeks and weeks. As a matter of fact, I left in May of that year, and there were still people bringing flowers to the site of this memorial. So it was this kind of remarkable moment. But the first time that I went down into the subway after this bombing, I was nervous as everyone was. And I made my transfer in the train station, the Park Kulturi train station. And when I get on the train, not long after, 1 or 2 stops after, a woman in a burqa gets on the train. And despite the barrier of language, there's a common dynamic that I recognize. Is the dynamic of tension and fear. And I know it because I feel it too. And I'm looking at this woman, and the woman is agitated and maybe seeming like to behave in a way that might be a little bit strange. And we're all worried that perhaps this is another woman from Chechnya, that she's going to detonate a bomb, that all of our lives are in jeopardy. And then something else dawns on me, that her actions are probably not driven by malice, but that this woman is fearful herself. I criticized myself because I thought that I should have been cognizant of this. As a 6'3" African American who walks around the world, I can assure you that I understand the dynamic of understanding other people's fears and the way that other people's fears have implications for your own safety. I think about this every time I walk across a darkened parking lot and there happens to be a white woman there. I know that there's an element of this person who's probably afraid of me, and that in turn, I'm fearful of what the implications of her actions might be. And so just yesterday, actually, when I was kind of preparing this talk, I was in the Pompidou Center, which I love. I just kind of discovered it the last time I was here. But I really kind of love this place, and I was there writing. And a gentleman who was sitting a couple of tables away from me made a very odd sound, and then fell on the floor. And to say he fell doesn't actually do justice to the violence with which he hit the floor. He went down very hard and began spasming violently. And my initial response was shock. And then within a split second, my next response was to look around for the people with the guns and the suicide vest. I was saying, this must be a diversion. And then when no such individuals showed up, and people began to gather around, and I speak no French, but I understood that someone was saying that he was epileptic. And people rushed to try to find someone to help him. And eventually a EMS person did come and escorted the gentleman out. He had a huge gash on his head from where he'd hit the ground, where he'd hit the floor so harshly. I think this is how democracy is undermined. I think what I take from the history of African Americans is that terrorism has as its goal simply to erode one's capacity to live freely. And that looking at the ascent of Donald Trump, who just yesterday said that he believed that all Muslims should be exiled from this country, from the United States, and coming here and kind of being a distant follower of politics and seeing the prominence with which Marine Le Pen has been discussed in the French elections, and saying that this is exactly the dynamic by which democracies are most commonly undermined. I read Nicholas Hanim, the French journalist who had been held captive by ISIS, and saying that he escaped. And he said that the thing that he found most notable was that people feared not the democracies themselves, but the extent to which their main fear was the extent to which these societies could manage to be open and tolerant of individuals who were different. They understood very clearly that their stock and trade, that their brand and their selling point was in attacking the isolated individuals, the people who have no place within Western societies, who have found no place in Western societies. The last thing I'll say about that is this. I don't hold that being an African American or recognizing this history in any way makes anyone exempt from these same dynamics. Last week, I did a ride-along with police in Newark, with the gang unit in Newark, New Jersey, for a document, as part of a documentary I'm working on. And these are kind of very hard-nosed, testosterone-driven, alpha male characters that you might imagine, who every night go out and knock on doors and raid buildings where there's drug dealing occurring, and deal with the gang violence that happens in this city. And I was riding with an African American police chief who is in his late 40s. He's a sergeant, actually. He's in his late 40s. And during the conversation, he talks about the violence in the city. He talks about the way in which the policing there has to deal with problems that are much bigger than simply criminal law, that these are social problems that are a direct result of decades of racism and neglect and poverty. And that he feels frustrated as a police officer simply being called in to say, clean it up. And over the course of the night, we ride around, we're together for about 4 hours, like far into the night. And then later in the evening, the conversation turns to politics. And he says to me, like, yeah, nobody, really thinks he can win, but, I'm definitely supporting Donald Trump. And what was notable to me was the extent to which he did not see the connection between these two things. The connection between the politics of contempt, the politics of hate, the politics of subjugation, subordination, and the eventual outcomes and ways that these things have played themselves out in the exact problem that he goes out each night as a police officer in the city of Newark to attempt to mop up. And so if I could summarize my sentiments in this conversation, it's simply that we, both in the United States and in France, have a concern about exterior enemies, a justifiable concern, a very valid concern. But my biggest concern, my biggest fear, is not exterior enemies, but of the failing will to be democratic internally. And this is, as always, the biggest threat, the biggest confrontation that democratic societies have to confront. Thank you.
I'm following a course from the University of Pennsylvania about slavery. The professor speaks about Virginia being one of the first states to bring indentured people from England to work the land. At that point, laws were written defining race as following the racial status of your mother. Is that true?
It is. It's one in the United States. It is, but it has a longer history in Europe. As a matter of fact, I think in its genealogy in French, people would use the word race to refer to a group, not necessarily in the way we think of them now, like skin color categories. And so, race has had a very muddled kind of history because it was an invented category. And so sometimes we say race and ethnicity, but the genealogy of those two terms, the etymology of those two terms is strikingly similar, because people would sometimes talk about ethnicities in the way that we would talk about races. And so then, of course, in like the classical idea, people would say that Teutons, Germans, were one race, and Anglo-Saxons were another race. I forget kind of all the categorizations they had that in the kind of classical sense. And then Blumenbach in the 18th century said that he distilled it down to the categories that we think of now. Think of Blumenbach as the father of anthropology. So he said there was a kind of Mongol race, which we would say were Asian now. And then there was a Negroid race, and he thought the most pure distillation of white people that he'd ever encountered were the Caucasoids, the people of the Caucasus, and this is where we get the term Caucasian, which is ironic though, because if we know anything about people from the Caucasus, they're dark. These are dark-haired people. It's like the opposite of what the Aryan idea of Nazism is that, very often if you interact with people from the Caucasus, we'd say those are kind of Mediterranean people. They're darker than lots of other whites in Europe. And so that's kind of the categorization. In the United States, we could have a whole conversation about the way that that plays itself out. But basically, race was established in the ways that moved hand in hand with the development of a capitalist economy heavily dependent upon agricultural labor and the most readily exploited group of individuals. And those, for lots of kind of practical reasons, turned out to be Africans. One, they're identifiable, with lots of the times when you look at kind of early American colonial history, people talk about indentured whites and African indentures in ways that are like strikingly similar. It wasn't uncommon in the 1600s for indentured whites and indentured blacks to intermarry. All the kind of racial baggage that we think about now wasn't really present. And that developed really in the latter part of the 17th century into the 18th century. And it develops pragmatically, what is the benefit and how can you most easily exploit, labor.
You said that Thomas Paine continued to think like a revolutionary after the revolution. I was trying to tie this in with your articles in the New Yorker. You continue to think about race when a lot of people in the States think that it's not necessary after the election of Obama.
I mean, so there's this idea, it was like a short-lived idea that, that the society, because the election of Barack Obama was going to be post-racial, it was like the shortest-lived idea ever. But I mean, even when Obama's election happened, it was like the month of his inauguration, there were 3 unarmed black men shot and killed by police. One was in New Orleans, one was in Dallas, and then one was in California. The one in California we know about because that became the subject of the film Fruitvale Station, as the death of a man by the name of Oscar Grant. And so those dynamics were present in the course of his campaign and in the course of his inauguration. And then beyond that, when we think about it, there are like all sorts of analogies that we could think to say like this is not indicative of where the society is in mass. Certainly was an amazing, stunning development in American history, but in and of itself, it didn't kind of absolve the country from history. It wasn't emancipated. The country itself wasn't emancipated from its own history, nor could it have been, because if we looked at India, we now have a problem with infanticide, where people, are killing female children, and also people selectively aborting if they determine that they're going to have a female child. And this is also a society that's had a female head of state. If we were to carry the racial analogy forward, we'd have to say that there's no sexism in Britain because Margaret Thatcher existed, or in Israel because Golda Meir existed, or in Argentina, or the whole array of countries. I had a mental Rolodex of them, all of which have had female heads of state, all of which still have sexism in their societies, and sometimes rampant sexism in their societies. And so the history has played itself out, and to the extent that we are shocked by it, it's only because we were operating on the wrong premises to begin with.
What do you think of this phenomenon of Donald Trump? Why did the policeman want to vote for him?
He thought that Trump was telling the truth about the threats that people pose, to the country. And he didn't say this outright, but I take it I suspect that he sympathized with Trump's immigration ideas as directed at Latinos, as he spoke about Latinos. But I don't think that anybody is exempt from this. I think that this is the kind of ambient climate that we exist in. And so, for that matter, the biggest contradiction, I suppose, would be Donald Trump. Would be Ben Carson saying that he didn't want Muslims to be president. And this is a person who only exists through the graces of the civil rights movement, which allowed him to move into the positions that he's moved into. And there'd be people who would be terrified, generations before, to say that they'd be operated on by a black surgeon. As a matter of fact, I have a friend I tell this story, he's the chief of surgery at Nairobi Hospital. And there's a white British woman, who comes into the hospital, older woman who is there. She has to have emergency surgery. And she wants to go back to the UK. She does not want to have surgery in Africa. And she's like, no, I don't want it. And they're like, ma'am, you have to have surgery. If you get on an airplane, you're going to die. And so she says she'll have surgery. And they said, well, the doctor is not one of those Indians or Pakistanis, as she used a derogatory term. And the nurse said, no, definitely not. And then Dave comes in, and Dave is like 6'4", jet black complexioned man. And he comes in and starts talking to her about the operation. And she literally went into shock when she realized that this man was going to operate on her. And so he laughed about the story, but it was like she had to be sedated in order for them to even explain what they were going to do to her. And she survived the surgery. And I'm sure she was kind of like, as shocked as anything else. She survived the surgery. But I think the idea that Carson exists, says something about that same kind of dynamic, which just as well could have been an American hospital, when he was coming along. In the bigger sense, what Trump's, I think, ascent is kind of connected to is that it's not unique in American politics. It's a very old strain of American politics, the conspiratorial thread of American history, which is very prominent. We saw it directed at Franklin Roosevelt, at Abraham Lincoln, at John F. Kennedy. Is a very kind of prominent theme of this kind of populist demagogue who comes to the fore, saying that there's a person who has subverted the will of the masses and so on. There's also my colleague Evan Osnos at The New Yorker has written a really good piece about this. There's also a kind of anxiety among a significant number of white Americans, particularly working class white Americans, about their declining status in the society. And Trump has tapped into that, managing to be both a billionaire and a populist. If we know anything about kind of American politics, those two things should be contradictory, but in America they're actually possible. And so I think, I went on and on, but I think those are some of the things that are at play.
There was a lot of discussion about race in America over the past months, with what happened in Missouri and in San Bernardino. How has that impacted the discussion on racism?
It's complicated because on one hand, the shorthand that people would say is that when students on college campuses have recently, University of Missouri, Yale, Ithaca College, actually too many college universities and colleges for me to name, when they were talking about racism on their campus and threats on their campus, when the immediate response that you heard was when San Bernardino happened, well, this is what danger actually looks like. You should be grateful because you're not dealing with these kinds of people, and we understand kind of radicalization as this phenomenon that happens among foreigners who have ill will toward the country. We don't ever talk about the radicalization of Dylann Roof in Charleston and how he came to have those ideas that led him to kill 9 people in a church, or this most recent incident in Colorado, where this person Deere has killed people at a Planned Parenthood clinic, and we don't say where does this radicalization come from, which is indeed radical, and so I think that we have categorized the violence in ways in which we're most comfortable with, in ways in which we have the least implication personally. But ultimately, I don't think that there's that great a deal of difference, a distinction between those types of radicalism. Maybe we're just more comfortable with denouncing one than denouncing the other. So thank you.